This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to discuss how the incentives faced by participants in the legal system impact the system's performance. First, we're going to discuss the incentives faced by judges and prosecutors in the government's criminal justice system. Then, my second guest will describe how market-based systems of dispute resolution function much differently. My first guest is Dr. Bryan McCannon. Dr. McCannon is Associate Professor of Economics at St. Bonaventure University, and he's written numerous research studies on the incentives and behavior of government prosecutors. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I guess let's start with, you study prosecutors and judges in the criminal justice system. What attracted you to looking at this in the first place?
Yeah, so not long after grad school, my focus was actually on crime and deterrence. And that was what my original research was. And then when thinking about the issue of sanctioning and how to deter individuals, I started getting more and more interested about the actual decision makers in the process.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, please.
Sorry, that's not the prosecutors, the guys who have the most discretion in the system.
Sure, and I mean, this is a hugely important topic because of the impact it has on people's lives. And here in Texas, in fact, here in Lubbock, Texas, recently, there was a statue that was raised to Tim Cole, who was convicted in 1985 for rape here at Texas Tech. And he eventually died in jail, actually. But after the fact, he was exonerated from this, and it wasn't him who committed the crime at all. And that's not that uncommon. In Texas, I think since 1989, there's been something like 147 exonerations. It's the third most behind California and New York. Are these things random, or when you study this, is it just, by bad luck occasionally this happens, or is there more kind of systematic way that it varies?
Yeah, well, we're dealing with a system with very poor information, right? Nobody has incentive, few have incentive to tell the truth, right? There's the people who are putting decision making are usually the least informed individuals, right? And so while there is some just randomness to the process, right, we can look for what would be some of the kind of structural institutional features which would be better or worse at having a correct criminal justice system that worries about victims but also worries about the wrongfully accused.
Yeah, I mean, worrying about the wrongfully accused has to be a paramount concern.
Absolutely.
I think most of us would rather see an innocent man, a guilty man go free than an innocent be in prison.
Yes, we don't use simple majority on juries.
Right.
Right? It requires unanimous agreement.
But yet we still get these errors. So what is
Absolutely.
it with the incentives that are faced by prosecutors or judges that might lead them to be more or less prone to making a mistake or being overly aggressive?
Yeah. So what's interesting, and as an economist, what's interesting about judges and prosecutors is it's not like other labor markets. We're not having people submit resumes and some higher employer looking at jobs.
There's no profit and loss system, right?
No, absolutely.
So we don't know what they add to the bottom line.
Precisely.
So it's going to be different.
That's right. And so for the most part in the U.S., kind of basically dating back to the Andrew Jackson time, we've relied on the criminal justice system on these popular elections to make decisions when other jobs we would be using more market-based system.
I wonder how many people voting on their judge or prosecutor have read the person's CV.
I imagine about none. There has been some interest in what is like media coverage of elections, right? And even the coverage there is mostly on, is he a family man, right?
Right. Does he have a dog?
That's right. What law school did he go to? Not actually about how he's performing on the job.
So how does this impact their incentives then? The fact that they're hired in this manner through an electoral process, how does that make their behavior change?
Yeah, so I mean, this is similar to any kind of bureaucratic office, right? Where they're what they're primarily interested in is whoever's the retention agent, right? Whoever's making the choice to keep or get rid of the person. Their incentives are going to be to make that group happy, right? Whether it's a pure bureaucracy where you have someone above you who's determined whether or not you keep your position or not. Here in the case, you want to make the voters happy if you're using popular partisan elections, which we do in the U.S., right?
But isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, it's not so obvious. It isn't a bad thing. That you would want your prosecutor, right? You want your law enforcement to be caring about crime, the quality of life of your community. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily. I'm not ready to conclude that it's just all bad, right? But we should pay attention to the incentive effects of these particular institutional features, like electing our prosecutors and electing our judges.
So how do they behave differently, either good or bad,
Yeah.
when they're up for re-election.
Yeah, that's right. So when I first started getting into the project of trying to think about their incentives, one thing that came up was they actually make dozens of choices on any given case, right? So you had to start breaking this down into pieces, into what types of decisions are we going to focus on first, right? And so the first pass was to look at elections and the decision to go to trial, right? Because that's something that that's a good, healthy debate in criminology, right? Like, is plea bargaining, which we use in the United States for the vast majority of crimes, but the rest of the world doesn't use nearly as much as us, right? Is this actually good, or is this is there value in going to trial and incurring the expenses that those have, right? So our first attack was to look at the effect of trials versus plea bargaining, and whether or not election and the re-election concerns that prosecutors have, whether it affects their decisions.
So, because supposedly it shouldn't, right? If they're just blindly...
Supposedly if they're doing their job, right, they're doing it the same regardless of whether or not someone's looking at what they're up to.
Blind pursuit of justice,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
But you don't find that, do you?
Absolutely. We find pretty big effects. So our first pass, we were looking at North Carolina data because it was just readily available and well published. There what we looked at was prosecutors across of every county in North Carolina across 12 years, looking at the proportion of cases that go to trial versus get plea bargained. And what we found was that when the prosecutor's running for re-election, there's this big surge in the proportion of cases that go to trial. And there's an extra effect if he has a challenger in the re-election, right? So it looks like what's going on is that they're shifting what they're doing with the cases, not bargaining so much, not coming up with this kind of mutually agreeable solution between the two parties, but instead going to trial, getting the publicity, hitting the news, and hopefully getting reelected.
So, and I know the data doesn't tell this, but just kind of thinking about it, it might be that they want to be perceived as being tough on crime, but it could be purely, if they're going to trial, they get in the press more. Free press when you're getting elected is a
I think
good
both
thing.
matter, absolutely. I mean, especially, there's a lot of small communities in the country, right? And prosecutors don't have not a lot of media coverage usually. The one time that they get in the news and people know who their name is when there's the big juicy trial, right? Nobody's paying attention to the bargaining that goes on every day in the criminal justice system.
Now, is there effect then on this actually in terms of the outcome, not just that they went to trial, but are they more likely to have wrongful convictions come up, or for that matter, for judges, if you've looked at judges at all, are they more likely to have other people overturn them later? Like, are they still making good decisions and it's just coming through the court through the trial instead of the plea bargain, or is there a difference here?
Absolutely. So, I mean, that one thing you want to know is what's their decisions when it comes to using the courts, right? But then obviously the follow-up question is, well, how good is this, right? I mean, if for example, what we have is a lot of people who are causing violence and harm to other people, and they're having to go to prison a little bit longer for their crimes, maybe that's not so horrible, right? But if there's mistakes being made, right? If there's inappropriate sentencing, overly harsh punishments, or just wrong convictions, that's a problem.
Right.
And so my follow-up project, I'm at St. Bonaventure's in upstate New York, and so it made sense to look at some work up there. So my follow-up project was to look at appeals of felony convictions in, it was Western New York that I was studying there. Read something like 3,500 appellate decisions, right? And what was kind of fun about that project is you can go back to when the original
There was
conviction
something
occurred.
fun about reading 3,500
Absolutely.
appellate decisions.
Well, yes. First of all, it's very time-consuming, but there's some strange stories. You start reading stories about grave robbery and this kind of craziness, right? And
Okay.
So there is a little bit of sick humor in seeing what's going on, right, in the world. But
So what is it that you find when you're doing this?
yeah. So you try to pay attention to issues like what type of crimes are being committed, and whatnot. But we can also link up the case to when the DA was running for re-election. Was the DA running for re-election while this case was in the courts, right? And what we find, and then we see whether or not that helps predict whether appeal will be successful when it hits an appellate court. Mm-hmm. Appeals come quite a long time afterward. Like the median case was something like 2 years after conviction, it's finally getting ruled upon,
right,
which is a long time if there's a
no
mistake.
longer has anything to do with the election cycle.
Precisely. But if you trace back when the conviction occurred, there was something like a 20% increase in the rate at which the appeal was reversed or modified if the DA was running for election.
So basically, they're more likely to take things to court and push things that eventually get overturned.
Yep.
So they're more likely to convict innocents when they're up for re-election.
Yeah, that effect was there. The effect that was a little bit stronger than that was overly harsh sentencing. Right,
Okay.
so there was increased rate of just having to reverse and get rid of the lower court conviction, but at almost a little bit higher rate, we saw that they needed to reduce the severity of the sanctions. Things like making two things consecutive that concurrent, or they went for first-degree assault rather than a third degree, which it should have been. Right, this kind of zealousness of the prosecutor in terms of going after overly harsh sentences was also a big effect.
Now, what about the judges? Don't the judges stop this from happening?
Yeah, that's hard to measure, right? Because what you have is you're always seeing judges involved, right? So how do you see the world without the judge trying to calm things down?
They're apparently not calming it down, though. If their decisions are being later overturned, are the judges subject to these same forces that the prosecutors are when they're up for election?
Yeah, I would say, there is a good amount of research on judges' incentives as well, especially when it comes like civil cases that would have special interest groups involved, for example, right, and where they need money for re-election. So that the research on judges is a lot of that is interested in, getting that campaign support, right, and how they might rule like in environmental damage cases or labor management type issues. That's what most of the interest is on judges. I don't know how much of an effect there is in the criminal justice system on the judges in re-election, because we specifically, for whatever reason, we decided a long time ago that judges need extremely long terms, right, to abstract them away from the re-election cycle. So, for example, in New York, the judges are sitting there with 12-year terms, right, while the DAs are going every 4 years for re-election, right? Yeah. So I think that might be contributing to the judges are just kind of always kind of acting the same, and the DAs are the ones that are really responding to election cycles.
Okay. Well, this is interesting because this is free to exchange TV. We're usually competition is good, but here the competition takes the form of elections, and apparently it's not necessarily a efficiency enhancing type competition.
There's another strange thing that for prosecutors specifically is that these guys, who runs against them, right? There's you only have a small set of lawyers in any given community, right? That could be, and oftentimes it's somebody subordinate who has to step out and run against his boss.
Yeah, always interesting.
And then you get fired.
These are the perversities that we get in this kind of monopoly legal system. Our next guest coming up is going to talk a little bit what market legal systems would do. So thank you for joining us. Up next, can market forces provide the equivalent of law? If so, how does it function differently than government-enforced law? Keep watching to find out. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Edward Stringham. I'm pleased that Dr. Stringham recently became my colleague when he joined Texas Tech University as an associate professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business and a research fellow with our very own Free Market Institute. He's also the author of the provocatively titled Anarchy in the Law. Ed, welcome to the show and to Texas Tech.
Thanks so much, Ben.
It's so great to have you here. So I want to follow up on the last guest, but first, this book that you published, Anarchy in the Law, this probably seems confusing to most people. This is like chaos in the law. Aren't these things opposites? What do you mean?
Well, the title's actually to be that things that we think of being chaotic are not necessarily chaotic, and that law and order can be produced in many different ways. So most people assume that law and order comes from the state. And in this book, I'm actually highlighting cases where law and order in the current society and in history has come privately.
Well, that's perfect that we have you on today then, because our last guest, Bryan McCannon, was talking about the different incentives that prosecutors face in the government legal system and how sometimes re-election is coming up cause them to over-prosecute when they should, and how their incentives aren't aligned with the social interest. What are some different ways that laws are provided without the state?
So most people assume government has to do things, and there's been a lot of economic theory and evidence that government can lead us astray, and Bryan McCannon's work is great on that. As alternatives, there's actually lots of private legal rules and orders that exist in the current world. And the one that most people have experience with is arbitration. When you sign a contract with your bank, with your credit card, with your cell phone provider, with your employer, almost always you sign an arbitration clause which says, I agree, if we have a dispute, we're going to have this litigated or arbitrated in a private tribunal through mediation, through arbitration, through alternative dispute resolution. So all the things that people assume government must do, it's been largely being contracted out privately.
So as a matter of like contract law, when you sign a contract, you basically opt into this private system. Some people would probably have a fear though of, well, when I do this, these judges and mediators, they're just going to favor the big high money clients.
Well, when both people sign the arbitration clause ahead of time at contract stage, it has to be fair. It has to be chosen in a way that it's not going to bias against the small party. Because if you sign a contract where you know you're going to be at the short end of the stick, you're going to be less likely to want to opt into that contract. So arbitrators and mediators, their entire lifeblood is on appearing fair and balanced. And that's one of the most attractive things about them. In many cases, the arbitrators are selected by both sides of the dispute. So one person selects one person, another person selects another person. And so you're not going to get railroaded by a private tribunal.
Right. So since both parties have to consent to this, if they ever appear biased in their decision making, it would hurt their business. It's profit and loss.
Right. They're in the business of being fair, efficient, and that's their reputation. So somebody can't come in and say, we're not going to be fair and efficient. Now, government judges, government prosecutors, such as the work of Bryan McCannon, show that in many cases they are biased, and there's really not much that you can do as a subject to them. You have no choice. Where with arbitration, the people who are selecting the arbitrators actually have a lot more say in how the system works.
So would you say it would be desirable to move things out of state monopoly courts and into arbitration and mediation when possible?
Yeah, this has been happening tremendously. So there's been a great move in this direction of the past 40 years. There's work on what's called the myth of the vanishing trial, where it's disappearing. People, if you get roped into a lawsuit, it'll take years. Your assets are tied up. It's tremendously costly. And most businesses and individuals can't afford that. You don't want to spend millions of dollars going through these legal processes where the vast majority of that gets eaten up with legal fees, with judge fees. Instead, it's much better to opt into a private system. In many cases, they're much more informal. Mediation is the most informal way of doing it. Negotiated settlement, where people say, let's just sit down in a room, let's leave most of the formalistic lawyers out of it, and figure out ways of solving these things privately. And this has already been going on dramatically for the past few decades.
I suppose when the people are picking him, it must have other advantages too, because like when we go see our medical doctors, we don't just go see one guy for everything. We might have a general practitioner, but then he refers us to specialists. Does the same, but that doesn't happen with government courts. You just go to a judge who hears all sorts of cases. What's it look like in mediation?
That's exactly right. So one of the main advantages of alternative dispute resolution is you get to select an arbitrator or mediator with expertise in that particular area. So it would be like going to your doctor and getting assigned some random doctor has no idea what they're talking about. That can happen with a government trial. Whereas with arbitration mediation, that's one of the most selected traits is people want to select an arbitrator or mediator who has expertise, technical expertise in that particular area, or experience adjudicating disputes in that particular area, where you don't get thrown to the wind with some random person who has no idea.
Yeah, and this would be on the incentive of both of the people going into this would want an expert. So some of them probably specialize in just, housing defect construction, or God knows how specific this stuff gets.
Exactly. So people can narrow in and be as specific as they want rather than taking things through chance, which can be tremendously risky. People just don't want that.
So all of this, though, is in the realm of business law and contract law. And what the prior guest was talking about more was criminal prosecution. Are there ways that private law or governance occur that aren't just disputes over contracts?
So commercial law is one of the easiest ones to do, but also things that are traditionally within tort law can be done and are being done through arbitration, and also different other types of private tribunals. So I want to highlight ones that aren't so formal, but they basically are handling things like tort law, criminal law, basically disputes between private individuals. And a great example of this would be things like a college. A college has
We're sitting on one right now.
an entire set of private rules and regulations within its realms to deal with disputes between students. Say somebody is playing their stereo too loud at night, or any number of disputes that could happen within a college. Rather than having that dealt with by the city police, it's internalized within the realm of the private sphere. So there's lots of examples of this in modern times. Historically, this was the case in colleges in England. When you matriculated into a college, you're basically signing almost an agreement that you're going to be a citizen of that college. And so places like Oxford University, Cambridge University had their entire private judicial systems where they dealt with a whole bunch of disputes outside of the realm of the government monopoly.
Providing their own governance. And these could be things like student honor codes, but also even dress codes and how you behave, where you go, and everything on campus.
Certainly. So student misconduct, cheating on exams, cheating on papers. You don't want to have that reviewed. I mean, you could, in theory, have that reviewed by government courts, but they've got too much stuff on their plate. They can't deal with it. Instead, we have these things done privately. You opt into a community and they say, here are the procedures, here's the student handbook. I agree to have all sorts of disputes settled privately rather than through the government.
You know, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about like other instances now. It's not wholesale, you know, of criminal enforcement, but just kind of islands of these contractual communities throughout our country. I mean, condo associations would be kind of an example of this, wouldn't they?
Oh, most certainly. So lots of disputes between neighbors can, rather than being handled by the local zoning board, can be handled by the homeowners association. And there can be problems with any type of system, but in most cases, they want to try and figure out ways where the condo association is maximizing the value for the members. So even though things aren't perfect, they try and make sure that there's not a lot of discord between the members, and figuring out how to solve these problems without escalation of disputes.
It sounds like all of these kind of have a common theme in that there's kind of a prior contract of how we're going to settle our disputes, and we don't even know what our disputes are going to be. Is that something that's common?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things can be done contractually, and when you opt into a system such as through a business contract, we're both opting into a particular type of arbitration, or a college, we're both opting into a particular type of private judicial system, it's very clear that we're only going to do it if we see the entire package of goods being mutually beneficial to both of us.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? I mean, we're both economists, so we're used to thinking about markets and profit and loss. And, you know, for society to become better off, we want businesses to take resources and combine them into something that becomes more valuable and they make a profit, right? And that's our signal.
Yeah, so when you have it done privately, you have people competing to serve the customer. In this case, the people who want to avoid disputes. People can opt into systems that are better for them. When the government legal system, they don't necessarily care about how people's well-being are. The prosecutor, in many cases, just wants to be viewed as, hey, I just convicted a lot of people, even if some of them are guilty. It's a totally different mindset. Yeah, sorry, not guilty, right? It's a totally different mindset.
Yeah, so it's Bryan, in the previous part of the show, talked all about incentives, but we're touching on a little bit of information here. If a college writes a horrible code of conduct and tries to enforce it, when a student's thinking, I want to go there, they might choose not to, or same in a condo association, right?
Exactly. So we've got something which historically was considered the realm of government being privately provided and bundled with something that is clearly private. So the condo association, their rules are meant to maximize the value of the homes within it. And those rules are reflected in the value of the association. Same thing with a commercial contract. When you opt into an arbitration system, the rules and regulations that appear in the arbitration clause are reflected in the prices of the contract. anything that would be bad would decrease the value of that transaction. Anything that's good is going to increase it. So we want to see this option where consumers can evaluate all their choices and opt into things that they like.
Fascinating. In this realm, the people writing the governance or the laws actually get profit and loss feedback of how well they're doing it. Amazing stuff. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Ben.
And welcome to Texas Tech.
All right.
Thanks for watching today's show. The first half was really interesting in learning about the different incentives that elections give prosecutors to maybe overdo it. And the second part I thought was just fascinating at looking at mechanisms of how markets provide little segments of law. I'm left wondering, how does it scale up? How might these markets do even more? I guess that's going to be a topic for a future show. We'll see you next time.